Shana Tova, everyone. So I'm going to talk about Israel. But Elliot spoke so personally and so beautifully, I feel like there's nothing left to say. Somehow I'm a rabbi, I will continue on. And I guess the biggest warning is that it's going to take me a minute. So relax. This is going to be a longer one, but not too long. And I promise you, Yom Kippur will be shorter. This past spring, there was a solidarity mission to Israel with Jewish educators from around North America. One night on a bus ride from the south of Israel to the north, after a long, emotional day, after visiting the site of the Nova Musical Festival, where the Kamas Massacre happened, after visiting the southern city of Ofakim, where dozens of Israelis were kidnapped from their beds and murdered, David Breifman, the CEO of the Jewish Education Project, checked in with his friend Mike Whitman, the director of lifelong learning at Temple Emmanuel in New York, two wonderful career Jewish educators. Mike was sort of disoriented that night. Mike spent the whole day in his kishkas, in his guts, absorbing the atrocities of October 7th, and more than that, trying to understand the subsequent reaction of the world, which has been, in many ways, unsupportive of Israel. A reaction which has been, in fact, often riddled with either implicit or explicit anti-Semitism, including fervent AntiZionism, even among Jews in America. So how you doing, Mike? What'd you think of the day, Breifman asks. Mike's response, where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? Here's a guy who's dedicated his whole life to Jewish education, of building Jewish communities and families. He's married to a Reform rabbi. After visiting the massacre sites from October 7th, he's lost, asking, does Jewish education have a responsibility in this negative response to Israel? Why isn't the world, or at least why isn't every Jew supportive of Israel after it experienced mass murder of historic proportions, of sickening, barbaric slaughter? For the past decades in America, Mike continues, we've disarmed our kids and families of what it really means to be Jewish. We failed to transmit what it means to be a part of the Jewish people, an historical people, where we stand within the context of a greater world. What do we have? 5.5 hours per week in conservative religious schools, maybe 2.5 hours per week in Reform synagogues, if we're lucky and they show up each time? What's been our priority all these years? It's like we tried to teach them, hey, it's cool to be Jewish. It's joyful. Look at the holidays. Aren't they fun? Have a bar bat mitzvah. You'll get a party. Take a trip to Israel as if it's Jewish Disneyland. Go to a Jewish summer camp and make friends. And what does this all add up to? Well, we see now it adds up to disinterested Jews. Jews bored of Judaism. And that's the greatest risk to American Jews. Not anti-Semitism, but boredom and irrelevance. Because we haven't taught Jewish history. We've missed the ikar of being a Jew, the essence, the dynamism of what it means to be a Jew in history. And so now, when something actually historically relevant happens, when Israel and the Jews who live in Israel are entrenched in an existential war on 7 fronts, surrounded by what's being called a circle of fire, when Israel and worldwide Jewry are in a war of propaganda with the UN's International Court of Justice, when Jews are in a war of propaganda with the media, a war of propaganda on many college campuses, and unfortunately with many of their professors, when Israel and Zionism are no longer politically bipartisan, we have generations of Jews who are unable to articulate what it means to be Jewish and why Israel is important. There are generations of Jews who feel inadequately equipped to deal with anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, who are unable to defend Zionism. And let me be crystal clear. Being a Zionist does not mean you cannot be critical of Israel and its policies. I myself have some very serious critiques and problems with the current Israeli government. In fact, you can and should critique Israel because it shows that you care and are engaged as a Zionist, as a partner with Israel. But if you're only critical and you also don't praise, embrace, and appreciate Israel's greatness, its genius and goodness, then you know what you are? You're just an abusive partner. But the problem here in America is that there are far too many Jews who can't even explain what Zionism is and why it came about in the first place. And therefore, a career Jewish educator laments, where did we go wrong? But the Jewish detachment from the state of Israel, this disentanglement between American Jews and the Jewish state, began long before October 7th. As early as 2007, social scientists advanced what became known as the Israel distancing hypothesis, arguing that especially younger Jews under 30 were not embracing Israel as their parents did or grandparents. A 2020 Pew National Survey of thousands of American Jews captures what is clearly an acute generational divide on what's called attachment to Israel. The 2020 data show that 67% of those 65 and older feel, quote, at least somewhat attached to Israel, compared to only 42% of those under 30. That's a 25% difference. That's to say more than half of American Jews under 30 don't feel somewhat attached to Israel. Similar generational gaps exist when it comes to, quote, following the news about Israel, at least somewhat closely. 74% over 65, 46% 30 and younger. Quote, seeing Israel as an essential part of what being Jewish means to me. 53% over 65, 33% for 30 and under. And, quote, feeling that I share a lot or some in common with the Jews of Israel, 64% over 65 to only 51% of those 30 years old and younger. These worrying statistics demonstrate deep divisions not only between young American Jews with Israeli Jews, but also between young American Jews and older American Jews. And while I understand the where did we go wrong Jewish educators lament, these divisions cannot be explained away by Jewish educational failures alone. We know that there's also a political element to this in the United States, and there's a left-leaning approach and a right-leaning approach. What experts say and studies show is that American Jews who are overwhelmingly liberal or progressive feel less and less at home in a Zionist discourse, less and less comfortable with a relationship with Israel, and have more and more disclaimers and hesitations about their support for Israel. And according to this left-leaning analysis, the problem is that because Israel has drifted increasingly politically toward the right. And when I say Israel's drifting toward the right, I'm specifically referring to a hardening of Israeli attitudes toward Palestinians, especially since the failed peace process of the Oslo Accords in 2000 at Camp David. What happened at the Oslo Accords in 2000? Then Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians under Yasser Arafat what Israelis thought to be nearly everything the Palestinians asked for. Yes, Israel would retain some security presence, but this peace agreement essentially presented the Palestinians with a sovereign state in the West Bank, the end of the then occupation in Gaza, the exclusion of any Israeli settlements, a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, and control of the holy sites in East Jerusalem. But Arafat walked away from all of it. And he walked away from it to no criticism from his people, either in the Palestinian territories or abroad. No op-eds in England, nothing. And what followed that in the early 2000s is the Second Intifada, which was a massive campaign of violence against Israel that before October 7th marked one of the darkest times to live in Israel. I was living there then. And then finally in 2005, Israel actually does pull out of Gaza under Ariel Sharon, completely ending its occupation. What happens? Hamas quickly wins an election to govern Gaza, and they immediately begin to murder all political challengers. And since then, many Israelis turned further right politically, believing that the peace process is hopelessly stalled, and therefore there's no rush to resolve the Palestinian question among the Israeli electorate. I should also note that Ehud Olmert offered Mahmoud Abbas an even more generous formal peace offer in 2008 regarding the West Bank, to which Abbas never even gave the courtesy of a response. And the thing about the Oslo peace process, which happened in the 90s until 2000, is that it was recent enough to where it's not really taught as history, and yet long ago enough to where people 30 years old and younger have no memory of it. Therefore, younger people don't appreciate, don't understand how the political situation came to be in Israel today and how Netanyahu came to power in the first place. The right-leaning view toward American younger Jews distancing from Israel is very similar to the Jewish educational lament I mentioned earlier. With the political right, the distancing from Israel is not a problem with Israel per se, but a problem of American Jewish identity, which is getting thinner and weaker, and therefore the connection to Israel is thinner and weaker. And so the left-leaning approach says, our work is to address the political and ethical differences between American Jewish progressives and Israelis over Palestinians, and the right-leaning approach is no, let's have stronger educational interventions with Jewish youth in order to strengthen Jewish identity, and along with that will come a stronger attachment to Israel. And that's where things stood before October 7th. After October 7th, we saw something else, which was that a huge part of the left in America and the institutions of the left is that they're mixed in with some serious anti-Semitic views. Since October 7th, we've seen some both implicit and explicit anti-Semitism in anti-Israel protests, where left-leaning groups intersect, such as Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ community, the Me Too women's movement, reproductive rights groups, and the climate justice movement, and of course, liberal studies departments on college campuses. It's not that every individual, of course not, in those groups are anti-Semitic, but we've certainly witnessed the presence of anti-Semitism at their anti-Israel protests. And as an aside, they've yet to organize an anti-Hamas or anti-Hezbollah protest. And now many Jews who were previously supportive of those groups have awakened in shock and may even worry that we've been essentially marinating our young people in political environments where there's an implicit anti-Israel and often anti-Semitic bias. And so, not all, but some are recoiling, evidenced by greater Jewish participation, especially in Hillels on campus and Jewish day school enrollment, since October 7th. That is all to say, the American progressive Jewish world is now trying to figure out where they stand on all this. For me personally, when I look at the Pew data and the generational divide over Israel, that an American Jewish grandparent is likely to be diametrically opposed over Israel with their Jewish grandchild, I just don't think it can be explained away by Jewish educational failure, and I also don't think it can be explained away by political leanings. For me, there's a breakdown in our understanding of what it fundamentally means to be a Jew because we've stopped telling our story. And when you stop telling your story, someone else will tell it for you, and maybe not in the way that you'd like. And it's heartbreaking because the core feature of the Jewish enterprise, religious, secular, you name it, is to tell our Jewish story. We're great at telling the Exodus with the structure of the Seder and Haggadah and Passover, but the story didn't end 3,000 years ago. Zionism has a story too. It's the story of the greatest Jewish achievement in all of Jewish history, which is the establishment of a Jewish state among the family of nations after 2,000 years of homeless wandering and persecution. Israel is the fulfillment of the grand, outrageous dream of the Jewish people. It's the greatest collective project of our people, of which there is still a lot of work left to do. And as unrefined as Israel may be, it helped save our people from annihilation in the 20th century, and it represents the hope of what can be for our future. We even include prayers of miraculous redemption, our prayer book, on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, because it is a miracle that Israel came to be. Zionism is an undeniable part of our Jewish identity, of our story, but we don't tell that story here in America, and I'm not sure why. See, these divisions and rifts over Israel amongst American Jews, of which October 7th exposed, is an educational failure in the sense that it's a failure to tell the story of Israel, but it's not a Jewish educational or rabbinic failure. It's all our faults. Because our story is not merely told in classrooms or from the pulpit. It's told at dinner tables, while sitting in traffic in the car. It's told in waiting rooms and on family vacations. That's when the questions arise as to what it really means to be a Jew, what Israel means in the Jewish psyche. And the best time to answer a question is when it's asked, which usually doesn't happen in front of a rabbi. And what I want to believe is that we have an opportunity now. We have a Breshit moment, a creation, just as the world was brought to order, created out of tohu vavohu, chaos and darkness, so can we build a new order by telling our story anew. So here's what you need to know about our story of Zionism. Zionism is a rescue project. Theodor Herzl, the founding father of Zionism in the late 1800s, predicts the Holocaust and the first half of the 20th century. And for him, the Holocaust is not the beginning, it's the apotheosis, it's the crescendo, but it's not the story. It's the story is that the Holocaust is merely the end of 6 decades of murdering and ridding Eastern Europe of Jews. After the assassination of the Russian Tsar in 1881, there's a mass wave of pogroms that doesn't stop for 40 years. 1,300 pogroms in the Russian Empire sends approximately 2.5 to 3 million Jews fleeing for their lives. And where do they go? They flee west to America, which was easily the most popular target of Jewish flight. That 2.5 to 3 million Jews come to America and thereby comprise the core of what we call American Jewry today. Only about 50,000 in Eastern Europe are Zionists and make Aliyah to what was called Palestine at the time, under the Ottoman Empire, and later under the British Empire. So it's really a tiny fraction of Jews who at that time were ideological Zionists, while the doors to America are open. But when the doors close in North America and quotas of Jewish entry are enforced, which they are, the Jews literally had nowhere else to go other than Israel. So what does that mean? What does it mean when someone identifies themselves to an Israeli as an anti-Zionist, especially a Jewish anti-Zionist? Should the Israeli not have survived or existed? Jewish Israelis couldn't have survived in the 20th century had not Israel been a place to go, had Zionists not been a thing at that time. The problem in America is that many see Zionists as Western, rich, and white. Many don't recognize or acknowledge the millions of actual refugees who gave Zionism its demographic backbone, and that Jews are frankly not white. We're other. The majority of Jews in Israel are not Eastern European Ashkenazi. And it is the character of those refugees that make up the core of the Israeli identity. And that fact, frankly, ensured Israel's success. Consider the War of Israeli Independence in 1948, what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba. Nakba, by the way, means disaster, and it began as an Arabic word to describe the disaster of the Arab army's failure to destroy the Jewish state. Later, the word Nakba shifts meaning as Palestinian elites redefine it to describe the displacement of Palestinians. And the chant from the river to the sea is actually originally in Arabic, min il maye lila maye Palestine Arabiye. It rhymes in Arabic, see? From this water to that water, Palestine will be Arab, but was changed to English to the sea and will be free in order to rhyme in English. Okay, fine. But now consider what the Jewish experience of 1948 was in Israel. It's only 3 years out from the Holocaust. Who are the Israelis at that time that are fighting in the War of Independence? About 1 in 4 soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces in 1948 are displaced persons, DPs, from DP camps in Europe that are still sitting on German soil 3 years after the Holocaust. The American Congress won't lift the quotas it began in 1921 until even after the Holocaust, even after the West knows about Auschwitz and the death camps. And so many Jews still can't leave Germany even after the liberation. But American high schoolers are taught American soldiers went in and liberated Dachau and Buchenwald. Great. Well, you know what? 2 years later, Jews are still living in those places, sometimes behind barbed wire, patrolled by British and American troops. Why? Because nobody in the world would take them in. When did the DP camps mostly empty out? In 1947, 1948, into Israel. In other words, that's a quarter of the Jews in the IDF, a quarter of the fighters of the IDF in the War of Independence are people who know, because history has taught them, that there is nowhere left on earth for them to go other than Israel. So when a Columbia University or UCLA protester or whoever accuses Israel that it's colonialist, or that Zionism is colonialism, one of the current iterations of anti-Semitic slander, tell them that 95% of Israeli Jews came as refugees with nowhere else to go. Is that colonialism? Israelis come from 60 different countries. There's no mother country Jews came from. Is there another colonialism with no mother country? Judaism's ancient tradition is one of belonging to the land. Every synagogue in the world faces toward Israel and has done so for 2,000 years. Every Jew has observed the Jewish calendar according to Israel time, Israel season. There's no colonialism with any of the features of Zionism. They're just not even close to the same thing. The problem is that since we don't know, we don't teach. We don't tell our story enough to withstand the assaults on Zionism. And the anti-Semitism of our day is stealing our own story from us and recasting it as one of colonialist oppressors committing apartheid and genocide. Their story treats every Israeli as racist, every Zionist as oppressor, as if all of us share Itamar Ben-Gvir's fervent, nationalistic, fanatical worldview. So the task of our day as Jews is to remember our story. Sure, there might be nuances and variations, but we need to tell some form of a shared fundamental account. And if it's not colonialism, and they accuse Israel as being too aggressive, too militaristic, too destructive, too brutal in its response in war, as though Israel is the morally deficient party here, ask them the question that Sam Harris, the thinker and author, posed, exposing the media's and many politicians' blatant moral asymmetry about this conflict. Ask yourself this: what would happen if Hamas and Hezbollah put down their weapons in war? What would happen? Well, the rational observer could only conclude that Israel would likely seek to create some sort of peaceful arrangement with them. That's the rational conclusion. What would happen, though, if Israel put down its weapons? I'll tell you what, the world would get to see what an actual genocide looks like committed by Hamas and Hezbollah. Now ask yourself, what would happen if Israel used its civilians? It dug tunnels. It used its civilians, women and children, as human shields in the war as Hamas and Hezbollah do. Unthinkable, right? What would Hamas and Hezbollah think in this scenario? They'd think they hit the jackpot. And again, you'd get to see what a genocide really looks like. The problem is that too many in America don't understand the enemy, and they don't understand the Middle East. They think every society is morally equivalent, and therefore Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Ayatollah Ali Khomeini are really just like them. It's not like they're upper-class, highly educated American suburbanites, okay? They're theologically deranged maniacs on a sociopathic, genocidal mission. The thing, not done. The thing about Jewish anti-Zionism in America isn't it primarily, Jewish anti-Zionism primarily lives in America because Jews around the world are in line with Zionism in Israel, is that it's a genuine and serious threat to the Jewish people. And I believe it's a greater threat than anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you why. We can endure and live with anti-Semitism, but I'm not sure the Jewish people will survive if Israel ceases to exist. That could break us. Because if Israel fails, the damage it would do to our story would be so traumatic, it might be irreparable. The damage, imagine that after all we went through for 2,000 years to get back to our land, all the creativity and genius and bravery that has gone into keeping it and making it thrive as the startup nation for 76 years, all that only for it to fail? Rabbinic Judaism saved the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE to this day. And I'm obviously a fan of Rabbinic Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism won't be able to save us if our current collective dream dies, if our collective project of Israel is ruined. So for me, how do I deal with all this personally? Well, I'm a faithful and believing Jew. I believe that God is in our story. Now, that doesn't mean that no matter what we do, we'll overcome because God's on our side. That's not what I mean when I say God is in our story. When I say God's in our story, I mean that I believe our people's story really matters as a part of God's world, as a part of God's intentions for humanity. So in a way, it means that we have an extra burden of responsibility to get this story right. And what it also means that God is in our story is our story's worth fighting for. And as Jews, we really don't have the luxury of turning away from it. Supporting Israel is not about supporting a particular political ideology or a particular prime minister or a national identity. It's a religious endeavor. It's a part of our prayers. It's a part of our history. It's unavoidably a core part of what our collective narrative in our lives are as Jews. Are we to take a Sharpie and just edit out the final words of the High Holiday Machzor? Which are, you know what they are? L'shana haba b'Yushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem, same words at the end of the Seder, Passover. And what it also means that God is in our story is that because I, as a child of God, as each and every one of us is a child of God, is that I'm inseparable from the story. The story of the Jewish people, the story of Israel, is my story. I'm inescapably in it. And therefore, where Israel's story goes, is where the Jewish people's story goes, is where my own personal story goes. And what's so overwhelming, what's really so frightening, is that our story is actively being written right now, where it's sort of been on pause for 2,000 years, dormant in the shadows. And it's now actively being written in front of the whole world, and the whole world is getting in on it, trying to write it for us. But the answer is not to decry it or deny it or give it over to others, but to own it, to own our story and help shape it in the ways that we can. And yes, it's true, We've been dealt an incredibly challenging hand with Israel's neighbors in the Middle East, as well as Israel and Jew haters around the world. But we've also been dealt a very strong hand because Jews have never been more powerful and capable than we are today. We have to know that we have the capacity to defend our story and survive, that we need not bend to our hateful, cowardly enemies. With the wisdom of our tradition and of our sages, with the resiliency of our people's history and spirit, with the faith, courage, and purpose that our Torah imbues within us, and with our communal unity, we will win. And our story will live on in a renewed era, guided by decency, with both a Jewish and democratic homeland for our people, and a vibrant, creative diaspora. L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim, Am Yisrael Chai.